2024. This is episode 45 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and as usual, I'm joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will go over some of the Week 2 action, surprises, letdowns, and then a couple of the big games coming up in Week 3. But Joe, let's start with what happened on Friday night. Now, two games happened. One of them we're going to talk about here. It's the Chris Collins Bowl. Duke headed up to Evanston to play Northwestern, and this game was not for the faint of heart. It was a double overtime win for the Blue Devils. Northwestern could not get across the line. They did have an impressive performance by Cam Porter, but ultimately the Wildcats come up short. Big missed opportunity here for the Purple.
Yeah, Sean, when you talk about bowls, games that could affect bowl eligibility, this is one that immediately comes to mind. I thought Northwestern, as much as their passing attack struggled, because it really did. 19 to 35, no TDs, one interception for Mike Wright. I thought a lot of what they did on the ground, which is something Manny Diaz teams don't really allow, was somewhat encouraging. However, at the end of the day, Sean, Malik Murphy is just a playmaker for Duke, and you saw that in spurts when he was at Texas. And I think that's the difference between a team like Northwestern and Duke. And I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but in my lifetime, Sean, besides maybe a Dan Persa or maybe a Kane Coulter before he struggled with those injuries, Northwestern really hasn't had a guy that, could run around and really make defenses account, especially out of the pocket. I think Mike Wright is a decent quarterback, but that's exactly what he is, and that's kind of the problem. In a game where Northwestern's defense really didn't do their offense any favors, you would think 20 points, frankly, Sean. I thought 20 points would be enough for Northwestern coming in, even throwing an interception. They were even on the turnovers and whatnot. So, I think this is just one where their offense just couldn't get it done in comparison to Duke. And, you got to tip your cap to Duke. Manny Diaz, year one. I think the ACC, based on, I know this isn't an ACC pod, Duke's going to be a team a lot of teams aren't going to want to play. I'm sure Miami's not really looking forward to the Diaz Bowl later on this year. But Northwestern, I think the one thing you could take away is your rushing attacks there. I think now you just go like crazy on the passing attack. 8 receptions for A.J. Henning, though, only 52 yards. Longest was 11. Bryce Kurtz was really taken out of the equation. I think they need to work to get those guys more opportunities in space. 11 yards for A.J. Henning, who's one of the more dynamic guys in the entire conference. I think they could do a lot better than that play calling wise.
Yeah, to be outplayed by that much at the quarterback position and still have the chance to win, it's a pretty decent team effort. And they were right there, giving up just 13 points in regulation. It was 13 all heading into overtime. They just gave up one touchdown. The stars kind of aligned for a victory here. They just couldn't get across the line. Duke did hit a field goal to tie it as time expired, but they probably could have scored a touchdown on that possession too. So maybe lucky to get to overtime. But at the end of the day, the Wildcats dropped to 1-1. They do face Eastern Illinois this weekend. We're not going to talk about that later, but let's hope for Northwestern's sake that they can get that to 2-1. Now, Joe, we're going to turn the calendar to Saturday here, and unfortunately, we've got to start off with your Michigan Wolverines. The big game of the week, game day was there. Big noon kickoff was there. Texas certainly came in as pretty heavy favorites, and they showed just that. They were up early and often, 24-3 at halftime, and they end up winning 31-12. But Texas is very much a national championship contender, and at this point, Michigan is not.
Yeah, Sean, I really think this is kind of unusual. I'm so used to Michigan basketball wetting the bed. Now, Michigan football, for the first time in the history of this podcast, we're talking after a Michigan football loss. So, weird territory for me. Overall, Sean, I think you're really on point. I think Texas is probably the second best team in the country. I know roster-wise, you could compare Ohio State, Ole Miss, perhaps Oregon.
Yeah, I put them second in the rankings this week.
Yeah, until those teams play more significant competition, especially Oregon shows better against competition too. I really think I'm operating under the assumption Georgia and Texas, and then there's a tier below, which incorporates the other 3 or 4 teams. That might include Alabama too. Sean, Michigan's game plan was so inferior to Texas's. I think that the talent on the field wasn't as big a gap as the game plan might have had you think, and I say that because Texas from snap one didn't want Michigan's defensive tackles to be involved at all in the game. Quinn Ewers, I actually thought Michigan, the one positive, they did a good job getting pressure early. They got him out of the pocket. Unfortunately, Quinn Ewers over the offseason, and you somewhat saw this last year in his first full season as a starter after he got injured in 2022. He's better out of the pocket than in the pocket. And that's what he showed on Saturday. Really made some good throws. He juked out a lot of guys running to get some first downs to extend drives. And that's kind of what Michigan's defense has struggled with in the past 3 years. And I say struggle pretty lightly because the defense hasn't really gotten destroyed by anyone. I think that was part of Ohio State's game plan in the offseason to get a guy like a Will Howard to run. And Quinn Ewers somewhat showed it by using his legs because at a certain point, the defense does such a good job covering and gets enough pressure. But if your QB could just run 5 or 6 yards for the first down, it's really demoralizing for a defense. I think you start to see that happen to Michigan. And offensively, I think a lot of people want to tee off on Davis Ward, tee off on the offensive line. My general takeaway wasn't that. I think they definitely have a lot of room for improvement, and there's nothing more humbling than getting spanked at home, and the likes of which you haven't seen since the Ohio State 2019 game, quite frankly. We're not going to count COVID. But, Sean, Michigan offensively cannot play from behind. It's very clear. Last year, it's a team that played 95%. Think about that. 95% of their snaps ahead. That's not going to happen this year.
Yeah, and the key coming into this game, Joe, that we said is if Michigan is ready, a lot has to go right. They've got to start off well, and they've got to sort of not fall behind, like we said, and that's kind of exactly the opposite that happened. Texas opens the game with a 13-play drive that ends up in a missed field goal, but nothing really the defense did. And then they score 3 touchdowns and a field goal in the other 4 drives. The defense did not get themselves off the field once in that first half, and that was big. And that's supposed to be the calling card for this Michigan team, and they did not show up. They were not at the level that many thought they were here in week 2. Now, it's still early, and this Michigan team is better than that. I think we can both agree that. But Texas looked ready, and this game was over like really quick. And you know, when it was 14-3 and Warren threw that interception, that's kind of when I said that this game's probably over. They're not going to be able to play from behind. I think the quarterback play was not great, but to be honest, we didn't really expect it to be great. It wasn't the reason why they lost. Their defense let them down early, and then they just could not get themselves really back in the game offensively. They did score their only touchdown with a minute or so left. But disappointing for Michigan because this was a really good opportunity for a big win, and now you got a couple more. But making the college football playoff would have been a whole lot easier had you found a way to win this because Texas is going to do some damage this year too. But Joe, you look at the stat sheet and just 2 receivers really making a difference, and that's Colston Loveland and Samaj Morgan. Nobody else with more than 22 yards. That's a big issue. And then like in terms of on the ground, Donovan Edwards just getting 8 carries. You know, you're down by a lot of points. You can't be handing the ball off. And then Mullings just getting 25 yards. So at the end of the day, utter domination at the hands of Michigan, something that we've never said really ever in 5 years. But unless you want to add anything else, Joe, we're going to move on to a couple of the other games.
Yeah, Sean, one comment I'll make is, you can kind of think of this in some of our college listeners. Maybe this is the pop quiz you flunked, and maybe you're going to get some mercy from it if you do well on the test, because the test is coming in 2 weeks. I think Wink Martindale, he's been a highly scrutinized hire, and right now he's certainly feeling the fire, and rightfully so. You have another NFL-esque mind in Lincoln Riley coming in. Sark was an offensive coordinator in the league for 2 years. We all know what he's done at Texas, Alabama, USC, Washington, you name it. Lincoln Riley in 2 weeks is going to provide maybe not as big a challenge, but certainly at worst a step down in terms of challenge. So Michigan, a lot to figure out this week against Arkansas State. Probably want to get that passing game going, trying to figure out probably what they could do that will work offensively, get some confidence in whoever the quarterback will be, which will probably be Davis Warren or perhaps Jack Tuttle, who knows. And then hopefully, for their sake, get into a big week against USC, which, by the way, Sean, they're still favored by 9.5, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, and USC has probably been the team that stock has risen the most since the start of the season, Joe. And Michigan is probably the team that's lowered the most. So coming in there, it'll be at least for Michigan, it's a big opportunity. And if they were to pull that one off, you're 3-1 with a good win. You're in good shape. But Joe, a bunch of other games here. USC did win big last week. Since we mentioned them, we'll just go over it really quickly. They beat Utah State 48-0. Now they were favored by 30, but this we're not going to talk about their game next week either, Joe. So if you want to get something in, they're bye next week. So their next game is at the Big House. But USC has looked very impressive so far. Miller Moss is all of a sudden in the Heisman list. Woody Marks looks like a really good threat on the ground. Quentin Joyner also scoring twice. USC looks really good, and Lincoln Riley, non-conference has gone pretty well so far as they head into the Big Ten.
Yeah, Sean, and I really want to point this out. USC's schedule is not the most challenging in the world. I think in a matter of 2 weeks, they went from a team that people thought of as like a 6-6, 7-5 team. They're number 11 right now. I think they'll be number 10 by the time they go to Ann Arbor. And Miller Moss, I want to point this out. He had an efficient game, 21-30. QBR was only 70.3. Jaden Maivia, albeit the backup in garbage time, had a higher QBR. I think this game just showed how much what they can do with their weapons offensively. Woody Marks, Quentin Joyner, Lake McCree. Zachariah Branch only had 4 receptions for 19 yards. I think perhaps they were holding stuff back, knowing that they would dominate Utah State the way they did. And, Michigan's going to have a long week of film, and I bet they're prepping for USC. Actually, I know they're prepping for USC a little already. So, you might need all the 2 weeks you could get with USC.
So now, Joe, we'll move on to another rivalry game here, and this was the Cyhawk game. Iowa State goes into Iowa and picks off a W. Iowa looked really good early. They're up 13-0, 19-7, but they cannot get across the line, and they end up losing on a 54-yard field goal as time expires in Kurt Ferentz's first game back in charge of the Hawkeyes. Caleb Johnson looks really good, but other than that, Joe, a disappointing loss here for Iowa because they really had it under control.
Sean, 3 quarters into the game, you think, well, Iowa's soon to figure it out. Even with Cade playing bad, and let's make no mistake, I'm a big Cade fan. I've always been. 13-29, 99 yards, QBR of 9.7, 2 picks, 0 TDs. He knows as well as anyone that's not going to cut it. But it didn't seem to matter early on. Caleb Johnson, 25 carries for 187 yards. The defense was clicking, and they even got a turnover one time at like the Iowa State 12. And what it came down to, Sean, is those 2 goal line stands for Iowa State, where Iowa had to chip in 21 and 23-yard field goals, I believe. That was the story of the game. Iowa State certainly didn't have as many opportunities to win, but every single opportunity they had, they took advantage of. Iowa probably had 20, and they only took advantage of 3 or 4. And that's really unfortunate for the Hawkeyes because I think, it's a matter of 1 point. If Iowa won this game 19-17, we'd be singing their praises right now and just laughing off how Cade played bad and they still won. Now, I think one positive thing Iowa could take away from this, similar to Michigan, it's a non-conference game. Their schedule is not necessarily any harder. I mean, no one on the remainder of their schedule, aside from Ohio State, looks like more of a threat. Maybe Nebraska, but we're still yet to see that. So, I think you could ride Caleb Johnson. I think you got to figure out if Cade's your guy at quarterback, and I assume he's still going to be. You got to get a better protection, and you got to find him easier routes because these receivers and getting open does not seem to be the easiest thing. I think Tim Lester, the pre-motion snap movement is really good. I think maybe they're overdoing it a bit. It certainly hit for big plays this week, but maybe simplifying a bit and getting them more comfortable.
Yeah, it's those 2 field goals you mentioned, Joe, both in the second quarter. Those were kill shot moments. Iowa goes up 21-0. They probably win this game. They're only up by 13, and they end up getting caught by an Iowa State team and losing a home game, which you don't see very often, even in some of the off Iowa years. So up next, Joe, we're going to go to the only Big Ten game of the week, and this was a pretty big upset. The Spartans go down to College Park. They overcome 8.5-point underdog odds, and Aiden Childs and Jonathan Smith pick up their first Big Ten win of the year. Week 1 was bad for the Spartans. They nearly lost to Florida Atlantic, but just like that, they're 2-0, and they're the only team, and they are at the top of the standings in the Big Ten right now. I would say mixed bag for Aiden Childs. He threw for 360, 3 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Now, you probably take that if you're Michigan State. You get a monster game from Nick Marsh, almost 200 receiving yards. Definitely, I was impressed with Michigan State here, but you have to say Maryland did drop the ball. They were big favorites at home, coming off a bad week for Michigan State. Got to be a little disappointed here for the Terps.
Yeah, Sean, I think it's twofold. I think Michigan State, I know Aiden Childs with 3 interceptions. People are going to freak out about that. I know a lot of Michigan fans who are just straight up Michigan State haters who will scream how Michigan State's not that good. And let's say that's true for a second. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, they're not that good, but they might be a little better than last place, like I said.
Yeah, but they found a way to win, and that's what it's all about. That's what this game's about. It's not about coming so close and looking good. No one really cares about that. The Michigan State running game wasn't anything special. I think Nate Carter and K-Rod Lynch-Adams, I think it was good to kind of open up the defense a bit. They each had long runs, 30 and 23 yards, but consistently on the ground, they didn't do much aside from those 2 plays. Sean, you're right. Nick Marsh is a freshman. He was a high 3, low 4-star recruit for a lot of his recruitment. Michigan didn't particularly go at him too hard, and I think they're going to start to regret that. I know that's Jim Harbaugh and a lot of the former coaching staff's doing, but still, he's a star in the making. He's a true freshman. Even Keon Coleman, when he was at Michigan State, he didn't do much as a true freshman. It was really his sophomore year, really his junior year, where he started to come into a star due to that 2021 room being a 3-headed monster with Reed, Naylor, and Trey Mosley. But Sean, Michigan State coming up, you've got Prairie View, you probably win that. If you win at BC, who is currently a ranked team, you might view this team a lot differently. I know that 4-game stretch everyone's going to circle, but the way Iowa looks, maybe getting to 5 wins before the end of October, that's more than realistic. And, I'm not going to get ahead of myself saying they're going to give Michigan, let alone Oregon and Ohio State a game, but in terms of being a Spartan fan, you could not ask for a better start.
And that 4-game stretch that we talked about, Joe, can be stretched to 5 now. Road game against BC is not what it usually is. And they're likely going to be going into that 3-0, which we said they've got to do their work early and late just because that's how the schedule rolled out for them. But so far, they're doing their jobs, and they pick up an unexpected win, definitely from both of our point of view. All right, up next, Joe, we've got what was the 7 o'clock kickoff up in Champaign, Illinois. The ranked Kansas Jayhawks go in there, and they take an L to Brett Bielema and the Fighting Illini. A pretty good fourth-quarter rally from the Fighting Illini, blanking the Jayhawks 10-0. Luke Altmaier plays okay. Defense turns over Jalen Daniels 3 times and gets the job done. Impressive win for the Illini.
Yeah, Sean, and last thing on Michigan State, sorry, I forgot this, pretty big. Michigan State's D-line looks a lot better. Maryland could not get anything going on the ground. I know Ty Felton goes for 152, but that probably played right into Michigan State's hands. They wanted them to exclusively use Billy Edwards in the air, so shout out to the Spartan defense, much improved. Now to Illinois to talk about more defense. Luke Altmaier in this game probably did what Cade McNamara had to do against Iowa State. And Kansas is a better team than Iowa State, so that speaks volumes. 16-25, pretty average showing from Luke Altmaier.
0 turnovers.
0 turnovers, though. Ran the ball somewhat decently. And you look at their rushing yards. Caden Began didn't really do much. His longest run was 8 yards, averaged 2.5 on 16 carries. The defense is what you're going to remember from Illinois. That's Brett Bielema's calling card. I know everyone remembers the body ball, the James White, all the running teams at Wisconsin. Those were built on good defenses as well. I think so many people get caught up in the star potential and whatnot. And that was on full display on Saturday night. Illinois went to halftime up 13-10, Sean. Kind of looked like they lost control a bit in the third quarter, but the entire fourth quarter, it looked like Kansas was panicking. Jalen Daniels, the one thing you could do, because he's still a really great college player, you can't let him get in a rhythm. And Illinois certainly did not let him do that at any point. Sure, they gave him some longer runs to Devin Neal. Probably some of their tackling wasn't as crisp, but they turned him over when they had to. And more importantly, Sean, uh, they rattled Jalen Daniels from the beginning. An interception to start, and more importantly, a fumble to end the game. That's just Bielema ball. It's not about, and it's somewhat similar to D'Antonio ball. We don't have to outplay you. We just have to not make mistakes. You make the mistakes, and we'll take advantage of them. And
And
Illinois did a phenomenal job doing that.
and Kansas is not a team that's going to do that very often. Jalen Daniels is definitely one of the better quarterbacks in the country, and he's going to have some monster games this year for sure. And Illinois gets across the line here, impressive for the Fighting Illini, and you have to say, Joe, that the bottom of the conference so far, or at least who we predicted to be the bottom of the conference, is performing very well. You've got the likes of UCLA, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan State, all with victories so far. Now, just Purdue also 1-0. So now it's good for the non-conference to go well for these teams because there might not be a ton of opportunities for W's when the conference season rolls around. But looking like a pretty strong Big Ten this year, as 6 teams are ranked right now, and a couple are just on the outside looking in. We have got 2 more games we're going to talk about here, Joe, from the Big Ten. And the first one is going to be Dylan Raiola and Nebraska. They welcome Shedeur Sanders, Coach Prime, and the Colorado Buffaloes into town, and they take care of business. They win 28-10. They're up 28-0 at halftime. Dylan Raiola totally rose to the moment. He, looks ready already as just a true freshman, and they get the job done in convincing fashion, and they end up ranked at the end of the week.
Sean, I want to give a shout out to Matt Rule and probably the entire Nebraska fan base. Ever since Bo Pelini left in 2014 or got fired, let's just call it what it is, he got fired. These are the kind of games Nebraska would lose. They couldn't get out of their own way. They would lose to teams. And I'd say Nebraska overall is more talented. Colorado's top half, though, are more talented. Travis Hunter, Shedeur Sanders. You saw that last year in the second week of the season when Colorado beat them. And throughout the entire Scott Frost and Mike Riley era, there'd be games they'd lose on Hail Marys, just inexplicable plays. Some people thought this would be the case from the opening snap. Nebraska put that to doubt. There was not a moment after probably the first 5 minutes, Sean, where I doubted that Nebraska was going to win. You 3-and-out Colorado. You sack Shedeur Sanders. You rattled him to the point where he's throwing his offensive line in front of the bus in the press conference. Not great. You turned him over on downs. Colorado in this game, Sean, on offense, it kind of looked like a high school varsity team playing a high school JV team at certain points. It was that shocking how inept Colorado's offense looked. And sure, you could blame Colorado like a lot of the media is going to do, but I'm inclined to give I'm inclined to give credit to Matt Rule and the defensive coaching staff at Nebraska. Nash Hutchmatcher going back there. Colorado could not run the ball. They could not throw the ball. They could not do anything. And more importantly, Sean, Matt Rule, Dylan Raiola looked really good, and I think that's partly because of Matt Rule. Now, is Dylan Raiola looking like Trevor Lawrence did his freshman year? No. But I don't think Matt Rule wants him to look that way. He wants him to keep it simple. Tony White, the defensive coordinator, is putting them in good positions, giving them good field position. And Dylan Raiola, all he has to do is not screw it up, which, for a freshman, 5-star #1 recruit in the nation for most of his recruitment, that's probably not the easiest thing to do ego-wise, but he's definitely given it to the program. He's a program guy. I really think he could mean to Nebraska what J.J. McCarthy did to Michigan. And, this is a really good start for Nebraska. This game was circled for a lot of the offseason, and to get through it, not to get ahead of yourself, but you got Northern Iowa Saturday, Illinois on a Friday night in Lincoln. Things are looking up for the Huskers. Now they have to hunker down or husker down, whatever they say. But as good a start as you could have, and I bet Matt Rule and that fan base is buzzing.
Yeah, they look really good, Joe, and I'm not inclined to say they're all the way back yet, but it's close if it's not already back. They've got some of the best fans in the country. They've got a fun team to watch. I'm inclined to turn on the TV when Nebraska's playing now, and I don't think you really could say that for a number of years. They're exciting. They they smoked another team that people think is exciting in Colorado, and I'm looking forward to watching them again, Joe, because as really everybody knows, or maybe not, if you haven't been watching college football for that long, Nebraska is a sleeping giant, and they do not need much to get things going in their direction until they are a pretty formidable force, and it looks like that's where they're headed. The last game of the night, Joe, for the second straight time, has been the Oregon Ducks not impressing. They get by the Boise State Broncos on a last-second field goal. They are 2-0. They've had two narrow victories against teams that they should have beaten handily, according to the spread. Dylan Gabriel, certainly not the quarterback that Bo Nix was. A couple of alarm bells going off for the Ducks despite the 2-0 start.
Sean, I'm not in love with Oregon the way I thought I would be early on. And I really say early on because Idaho and Boise State, you're playing two teams from Idaho. I know Boise State's done what they've done. Come on. Really? Defensively, I mean, there's so much to pick apart. I understand you had to commit to stopping Ashton GT. He still ran all
Yeah,
over
he
you.
didn't.
And I know he's probably a guy that could end up in New York. As in terms of a non-Power 5 guy to end up in New York, he certainly could do that. Sean, their quarterback, Maddox Madsen, who beat out Malachi Nelson, former 5-star, I don't know how, 17 of 40, 148 yards, QBR of 57.4. You would think with that stat line that Oregon must have blown Boise out of the water if they were attempting that many desperation passes. This was a game the entire way through. Boise State in the second half, I mean, the second quarter dominated Oregon. Only had a 6-point lead, and that's probably what did them in ultimately. They didn't capitalize when they were the dominating team. Oregon in this game, they made the plays when they had to. I don't know why they are so adamant on running Dylan Gabriel so much. He only got his longest run was 9 yards, and to put a guy out there who's had some injury history running around like that, when the guy is a passing threat, I know he hasn't shown it as much in a Ducks uniform in 2 games. You're really playing with fire there, Sean. I know Dante Moore was a former 5-star. He had a lot of problems at UCLA last year. Let's call it what it is.
Yeah, and you can say, Joe, that those games shouldn't have been close, and they shouldn't have, but they were. And now these teams are getting a little better when you bring them in. So at the end of the day, they have not been impressive so far, and their ranking has suffered. They've dropped, a number of spots to ninth from third without losing a game. And crazier things happen on the road in rivalry games. I'm not totally writing off a victory or a loss here, especially the way they've looked on the defensive side of the ball. All right, Joe, that's all of our week 2 recap. We talked about all those games. USC, Ohio State, and Indiana also had humongous victories, good for the conference. But unless you want to add something else, we're going to move on to the week 3 preview.
Yeah, Sean, just one comment. Penn State, I think that's just a clunker. I know that's what you call post-big win hangover because West Virginia is a big win. It was hyped a lot of the offseason. One thing, Drew Aller just needs to get it together. and the defense has a lot to figure out. But it's good to figure that out after a win against the MAC team versus a loss against the MAC team. Like you're not so distant neighbors in South Bend, but they're not a Big Ten team, so we're not going to spend this time ripping Notre Dame, which a lot of people can do.
Yeah, there was, like you said, a team that wasn't so lucky. They got a 1 in the loss column. Better to learn your lesson in a close win than a loss, especially for a team like Penn State, who have had trouble winning the big games this year. If they do want to make the college football playoff, they can probably get away with doing that again, but they can't lose any of these. So they get away with it. They end up winning by touchdown. It was touch and go there for a minute. They were up. They did take the lead in the third quarter, and then they did score a touchdown to go up 10 with 4 minutes left. So it's not like it really went down the stretch, but definitely should not have been as close as it was. Week 3, Joe, we've got the big noon kickoff in Madison, Wisconsin, as the Badgers host Kalen DeBoer and the Alabama Crimson Tide at Camp Randall Stadium. Wisconsin is 2-0 with victories over Western Michigan and South Dakota. And the Crimson Tide are 2-0 with victories over Western Kentucky and South Florida. A big, big test here for the Badgers as the road favorites come in with 16-point favorites. That's a big one, especially with two teams in the Power 5. But you giving Wisconsin any chance of even making this a game?
I think there's a way for them to make this a game, but after what I saw in the premier Big Ten matchup last week, I'm not so encouraged. And the reason I say that, Sean, is Wisconsin's defensive line has been a topic of concern a lot of the offseason. It was somewhat on full display against Western Michigan. South Dakota, I think, is a lot less of an opponent that as opposed to Western Michigan, but this is an execution by fire, or trial by fire, rather. That can become an execution because Wisconsin's defensive line having to defend against Jam Miller, let alone Jalen Milroe, who, even if you just watch Jalen Milroe in the Rose Bowl or against Georgia last year, he's a cheat code. If you played the video game, you probably figured that out too. The guy gets out of so many situations, and if Wisconsin can't get pressure, the guy's going to have as much time as his legs allow for, which will be a lot. And I know Alabama might not have the star receivers. I know they have Ryan Williams, the freshman. I know they have Jeremy Bernard, the former Michigan State and Washington transfer. Those guys are effective enough, and given enough time, they usually get open. And Wisconsin, offensively, aside from Ches Malusi, it's going to be really tough for them to get anything going, I imagine. Tyler Van Dyke, I feel really bad for the guy. I think he did a lot of good things at Miami. I do think bad coaching and bad play calling somewhat ruined him there. This is the game him and Coach Longo have to get together and deliver a masterclass to keep it close. And, I sound really negative about Wisconsin. It's really just about the performances. I think your outlook, no matter what, after this game, even with the loss, shouldn't be that terrible. I think you just want to have a good showing and show your fans that you're on the right track, especially in a new regime. So, Sean, they're going to have to do a lot. The keys are defensive line's got to hold up, and Tyler Van Dyke has to be the efficient guy he was at Miami and allow Ches Malusi to run not against a loaded box, essentially.
Yeah, the key here is that the result has to be in doubt at halftime. And if you're down by 4, you're down 13-10, well, that's still in doubt. That counts. You got to give yourself a chance and come ready to fight for the first 2 quarters at least. And then you go to your locker room, you get the fans believing a little bit. That's how these things happen. They don't win by making mistakes early and being down 21-3, and then the game is over. Jalen Miller has been to the college football playoff. Kalen DeBoer has been to the national championship game. The moment's not going to be too big for Alabama. They're going to have plenty of road environments, probably tougher than this one. So, it's a great opportunity for the Badgers, though. Very, very rarely do you get a non-conference team of this caliber coming into your house. And let's hope for the Big Ten's sake that they put up a fight. But the spread, what you said, Joe, it's going to take a lot. I don't see it, and I see a pretty comfortable victory for the Tide. Now, the next game we're going to go to, 3:30 on CBS. It's those Fighting Irish who took a loss to Northern Illinois last week, and the Purdue Boilermakers who were on bye. Purdue did beat the Sycamores of Indiana State 49-0. And despite Notre Dame's loss last week, it's still a big step up in competition. The Irish come in going to West Lafayette as 10-point favorites. They're looking to bounce back, giving the Boilers any chance to make Notre Dame 1-2.
I give them a significant chance, Sean, and I know historically Notre Dame, after huge letdowns, have come out, and even in the Marcus Freeman era, I know I'm not going to count the 2022 Ohio State losing to Marshall as a letdown. You lost to Ohio State. No one was expecting you to win that game. Um, One thing that's particularly of concern for the Irish is Riley Leonard. The guy hasn't thrown for a TD yet. He's been reckless with the ball. There are times when he goes down, and I don't think he's securing the ball the way he should. And against the guy, against a defensive head coach, that's not really what you want. Ryan Walters, he's from the Brett Bielema tree. He definitely watched Illinois, or definitely watched highlights of Illinois doing what they did to Kansas. I'd be shocked if he didn't show that to the team. And Notre Dame's reeling, and I really think Purdue can deliver a huge statement. A lot of people have picked Purdue to be a bottom three team in this conference. A lot of people have written them off till 2025 or 2026, only kind of giving them credit on the recruiting trail. If you beat Notre Dame, especially the state of Indiana, you beat Notre Dame. No one's going to discredit you. Hudson Card, in the one game he's played, 24-25, 273 yards. Devin Mockabee, I think, is a really effective weapon they could use. What it's going to come down to, Sean, is Notre Dame's secondary is still one of the best in the country. Ben Morrison, and don't throw to Ben Morrison. That's all I'm going to tell Purdue. If you could not turn the ball over, let Hudson Card make some throws. The guy's a playmaker. He didn't play at Texas because he was a scrub. And you let Devin Mockabee get into space. You're creative with your play calling. I think spread of 7.5 is just about right. I think Purdue could be in this game till the end.
And, Purdue has a better quarterback here. I think that's pretty clear. Now, they might be outmanned in every other position, but we've seen games where a better quarterback can, like Duke Northwestern, can get you across the line. That's how they're going to win this. But let's not forget, Joe, just 2 weeks ago, this Fighting Irish team did go into Kyle Field and beat the brakes off Texas A&M. So which team is the real Notre Dame? Their defense is really good. That's definitely true at this point. But Hudson Card's a good quarterback, and that's what it's going to take to unlock this Notre Dame defense. I think they do keep this close and probably cover the spread. And who knows, maybe at the end of the game they do get across the line in what would be a crazy start to the season for the Fighting Irish and for Purdue, really. All right, Joe, we've got two more games I want to talk about here. This is a team that we really haven't spent a lot of time on this year. They're one of the newcomers, and that's the Washington Huskies. They host Wazoo in their annual former conference rivalry game. They are 2-0. They have victories over Weber State and Eastern Michigan. Haven't seen much of the Huskies so far. New coach, new conference, but a little bit of familiarity here as they host their rivals.
Sean, I'm a big fan of Will Rogers play the last two games. The biggest criticism of him at Mississippi State with Mike Leach and somewhat of last year, and I know Will Rogers got injured, which is why I'm not going to discredit him for his 2023 campaign. He turned the ball over. He was a Cowboy. And that's not to blame. That's not to put any blame on Will Rogers or the coaching staff. That's the traditional air raid offense we grew up watching when Mike Leach was at Texas Tech, at Wazoo, and sadly only for a few years at Mississippi State. 41-52, 511 yards, 5 TDs. Will Rogers not turning the ball over, if he could continue that into conference play, Washington might have something. Now, I'm not going to tell you they're going to make the 12-team playoff, but I think them overperforming their 6.5 or 7.5 over-under total a lot of people have had them at is certainly on the table. Now, I want to give credit to Jonah Coleman, too, Arizona's ex-running back, went over with Jed Fish. And Giles Jackson, the 6-year man. A lot of you remember him at Michigan, speedster. Had some problems here and there, but he's really shining now. I think he probably learned a lot from Roma Dudze, Jalen McMillan, and Jalen Polk. And, they have something there. A dynamic guy, not the tallest guy. A guy who could move around. And with Will Rogers, a guy who's really accurate, it's shown that he can be really accurate. Washington State's leading rusher, guys, is their quarterback. I think if you take him out of the game plan's very simple for Washington. So I do think this is a game to watch, and I really want to see if Will Rogers could maintain his poise and not turn the ball over, and to see if the Washington Husky rushing attack is for real. Because if it is, Washington's going to provide a lot of problems for teams that didn't really account them as a contender.
And Washington State did beat Texas Tech 37-16 last week, so this is a good test for Washington. They're the home team. They're 4.5-point favorites, so these teams are pretty even across the board. But it's a rivalry game at home. You'd like to think that the crowd, actually, it's not a home game. It's a neutral. My bad, at Lumen Field where the Seahawks play. So, I do think Pullman is much further away in my experience with Washington geography. Washington is in Seattle or around there somewhere. Pullman is on the other side of the state, nearly Idaho. So you'd think that Washington would have a serious fan advantage there despite it being a neutral. And it's a good opportunity for them to be 3-0 heading into Big Ten play. They host Northwestern. That we talked about it. There's a chance they could be undefeated when Michigan goes over there. And it starts with a victory here. But we've got one more game we're going to talk about, Joe. It is the only Big Ten game of the week. And it is Curt Cignetti and the Indiana Hoosiers going to the Rose Bowl to face UCLA. The Hoosiers have looked pretty good so far in their two games. UCLA has just played that one game in Hawaii. Indiana slight favorites going on the road here. What are you looking for?
I'm looking for Indiana to just continue the momentum. Curtis Rourke's been phenomenal. I think David Jackson even looked pretty good in mop-up duty. I know it was against a really terrible opponent last week, but it's something, and I think Indiana just has to capitalize off that. It's a team, let's face it, Sean, since COVID, nothing's really gone right. I know they had one win on the road against Michigan State in 2022, but even then, that was against a team that went 5-7. So I think a lot to like here. I think Justice Ellison, the Wake Forest transfer, has been a really pleasant surprise on the ground for them. And Sean, this is a game, I can't believe I'm saying this, because if I said this in 2022 or even in 2023, you guys would have thought I was crazy. This is a game Indiana just doesn't have to beat themselves in. Ethan Garber's really struggled in the one game they played against Hawaii in. And unfortunately for him, I feel bad for the guy. I think he was a pretty decent recruit. And, he's been through a lot at UCLA, from getting benched to having to fill in and back up and whatnot. I really want to see him succeed. But the writing on the wall is that he's just not, only threw one TD against Hawaii, had 2 picks. And UCLA has gotten nothing on the ground, which is not going to be a good thing for a running back coach like Deshaun Foster. So, Indiana, I think the key to the game is just offensively, continue to do your thing. Obviously, be smart, which I think Curtis Rourke will do, being the veteran he is. And let UCLA beat themselves. I think this is a team that's really uneasy. I don't think their win at Hawaii was in any way convincing, especially being a 3-point victory. And I think this is a game where this 2.5 spread, I think Indiana is going to cover it, Sean. I think if the Hoosiers get a few turnovers and they stay within what they've been doing, they could really make this ugly and could make a statement to the entire conference that maybe Indiana's not a bottom feeder for this year.
Look, it is a great opportunity to get a first Big Ten win for Curtis Rourke, Curt Cignetti, and the whole team, really. They are the better team on paper. That's pretty obvious so far. And the Rose Bowl has been a interesting place for UCLA over the years. They don't really fill it, especially it being that it's a Saturday, it'll be 4:30 local time. Seriously doubt it'll be filled for a team like Indiana, but still, it's impressive. It's a good chance to make an impressive statement for Indiana, and they're certainly probably a little better than we both gave them credit for, but gotta put up here. You've beaten 2 teams that you should have smoked. You did. And now you get your first test before Charlotte and then Maryland and Northwestern in Big Ten play. But, Joe, that's all the games that we really need to talk about from Week 3. Maryland is slight favorites on the road at Virginia. You'd like to see them bounce back after the loss to Michigan State. You've got Northern Iowa going to Nebraska, Troy going to Iowa, but a number of games other than the ones that we talked about that should be victories for the Big Ten.
Yeah, Sean, and one comment I'm going to make is the upper tier of this conference really hasn't had to pull their weight or hasn't pulled their weight. Michigan certainly went to bed, not in terms of not winning, but in terms of looking embarrassing for a national title, for a defending national champion. Wisconsin, I'm going to reserve my comments on them until next week, but really the lower tier of this conference, even Minnesota losing to North Carolina, I thought they outplayed North Carolina a lot of that game. It's really been impressive. And, Sean, to avoid embarrassments like Notre Dame, the main embarrassment in the Midwest right now is Notre Dame. Let's call it what it is. And the Big Ten's looked pretty good. The lower tier of the conference has done really well. Michigan State certainly ahead of schedule, which is great for the conference. And Illinois over Kansas, Nebraska over Colorado. Those are 2 wins against the Big 12, which I know a lot of people have called not as top heavy, but that's a conference where a lot of people think 10 of those teams are pretty good teams. And to see the bottom feeders of the Big 10 get wins against them and won in a dominant fashion, that's a promising sign. I think it's time the big boys of the conference, the Oregons, Michigans, and start to pull their weight, because USC to the bottom have done their work. So good to see.
Yep, starting in week 4, we will have a number of Big Ten games. And then really after week 4, Joe, we're done with the non-conference games until, a knockoff here or there late in the season. Like we got USC, Notre Dame, stuff like that. But, these teams, there's not a ton of freebies in college football, especially for the teams who schedule a non-conference game. And, just like that, we're almost there. So week 3 will be this weekend on Saturday across the networks. And then we'll be back next week to talk about it. So thank you, everybody, for tuning into this episode.